title of our presentation is Scaling Up Positive Behavior Supports for Secondary School Students with Disabilities. So we'll be talking about that as we go along here. Our objectives, we have 3 learning objectives today. First one, we'd like you guys to understand the importance of contextual fit, and we'll get into what that really means. The importance of contextual fit when we're developing behavior support plans and we're executing these positive behavior interventions for students. Second, we would like you to become familiar with behavior support plan processes that engage family and school personnel. It's one thing to develop a behavior support plan, but what we're really looking to do here is to do this in a manner that brings the family and the school together and also engages these folks in the actual interventions, because these folks are the ones that will actually be implementing these plans. Third, Jeff's going to start us off with a little talk on the competing behavior pathways model. And so really what that's going to do is, when Jeff introduces that and Aaron continues with that, is that's going to provide a model for us to accomplish our first 2 objectives. We're going to start a little bit with the law here. Federal law, the Individuals with Disability Education and Improvement Act, says if a student's behavior impedes his or her learning or the learning of others, then the school district must implement positive behavior interventions and supports to address those behaviors. Okay? We have a couple vague terms in there. One, impedes learning. Well, what does that mean? That's something that the courts are continuing to hammer out. And the other term we have in there is positive behavior interventions. We're going to use that term a lot today. We're going to use it interchangeably with positive behavior support plans, positive behavior intervention plans, behavior intervention plans. But these are all interventions that are designed to improve the quality of life of individuals and change behavior using instructional and positive means. Okay? All right. The feds go deeper. They say, if a school district takes disciplinary action against a student with a disability, an identified disability, that results in 10 days or more of suspension, then the school district is required to conduct a functional behavior assessment and either look at the plan again or come up with a new behavior support plan. So we're talking about secondary students in our presentation today. So I've worked K-12 in my career here in schools, and this idea of suspensions is really important for secondary students, because what we see is middle school and high schools are far more likely to suspend students. So this is a really important point, so I just want to make sure that we hit that. If we go beyond 10 days, we need to have a functional behavior assessment and a behavior support plan. So we have these mandates. You will conduct a functional behavior assessment, and you will use positive behavior interventions. Given that, there are no federal regulations that clearly tell us what this means. Okay? Furthermore, if we look at the research that identifies how states implement these regulations, we see that there's quite a bit of variance. If you were a school professional, and you were trained in one state, and you move to another state, there may be so much different between the 2 states' laws and implementations, you might actually have to start over. There may be so much interference. The nice thing is that there's a fair amount of research. So if you're well versed in the research, movement from state to state is not going to be too much of a deal breaker for you. In California, we have something called the Hughes Bill. So the Hughes Bill actually specifically addresses certain behaviors, dangerous, assaultive, self-injurious, pervasive maladaptive, or severe property destruction. So in California, if that law is kicked in, that is an exception to this kind of vagueness that we're talking about with what constitutes a behavior assessment or behavior intervention plan. The Hughes Bill really spells out exactly what must be included in that assessment and what must be included in the interventions. And the Hughes Bill uses a term called a functional analysis assessment for their assessment and a positive behavior intervention plan for the intervention component. So that's just in California. It's California, FAA, PBIP. Okay, so if we look, we have some vague laws. If we look to the research and what the researchers tell us about FBA, we see that there's different levels of FBA. The simple level, 20 to 30 minutes, just an interview. Usually this might be for a behavior that's less dangerous. And then we go from there to what's called a full functional behavior assessment. When we do a full functional behavior assessment, we're going to review records. We're going to look, we're going to identify, is this a behavior that's been seen before? What interventions have been tried? We're going to interview the important people. We're going to interview parents. We're going to interview teachers. Oftentimes we can interview the student. What the research tells us is that the student's verbal, that student's going to be more likely to tell us the function of their behavior accurately than their teacher or their parent. So if we have a verbal kid, let's ask them. And our last step here is the functional analysis. This is a little confusing because in California you have this thing called the functional analysis assessment, and in the research you have something called a functional analysis. This functional analysis refers to actually manipulating environmental variables. So often this is not done in school setting. You see this done pretty regularly in clinics. Well, they'll actually have a room dedicated to just doing that. And it's going to be a pretty dry room, not a lot going on, so they can really control for those variables there. Okay, so we have this mandate. Functional behavior assessment, positive behavior interventions. So the next question we need to ask is, are schools able to execute a behavior support plan in general, or can we do these interventions in schools? And can we get good outcome? And does function matter? Does that assessment we gained from our functional assessment make a difference in our interventions? I'm going to cite an article here. This is from Ingram, and just looking at just that. So we have 2 6th grade boys. These are typically developing general education students. And what they did is they developed 2 behavior support plans for each boy. One plan was based on the functional assessment, and one was not. Both plans included best practice behavioral programming. Okay, so let's see what this looks like here. Here's our first boy. Grab the pointer here. This baseline right here, so this is before any systematic interventions. You look at our scale, so this 50, this means 50% of the intervals this student was engaged in problem behavior. So you can see at baseline, he's engaged in a pretty high rate of problem behavior here. Our first behavior plan is this function-based one. So what do we see right away? We see a drop in problem behavior, which is what we wanted to see. Okay. Then we go, change phases, our non-function-based plan. Behavior comes back up, pretty similar level here to our baseline data. So even though we have a lot of best practice behavior programming happening here, that behavior plan is not based on the functional assessment. And actually, in fact, a lot of the interventions that they selected for these non-function-based ones would be interventions that you would purposely avoid if you knew the function of the behavior. Okay, so anything could have caused that. So what we want to do again is look at another phase change here. So they go back and they re-implement the function-based behavior plan. And again, we see a drop. And then we go to the non-function-based, and it comes back up. So we can see that pattern clearly. So that's our first boy. So what we're seeing here is that, yes, indeed, function matters. If we look at the second boy here, again, we see baseline. Look at this first data point. That's about 92% of intervals engaging in problem behavior. Each of these arrows marks a day when he forgot his medication. So we know that affects behavior, so they tell us that. Okay, so we see, it looks like the medication probably plays a factor, right, because these days are higher. But overall, we see a level about right around here when this youngster does not have any systematic behavior interventions, okay? When they worked with this kid, instead of providing the function-based behavior plan first, they first went to the non-function-based, so the one that they hypothesized would be less effective. And we see that initially it starts off and it's pretty effective. Maybe there's some novelty effects there, and then it starts to kind of lose its luster. When we go to the best practice behavior plan based on the functional assessment, we're seeing numbers really low here again. And then they do a couple more just to check it out, just so we can prove that we have control over that. So we know that there's a mandate. We know that function matters. So what does the research say on students with autism, or ASDs, and these practices? What we see here is a chart. On the top, it is the established treatments identified by the National Standards Project. And on the left here, it is the evidence-based practices identified by the National Professional Development Center on ASDs. Okay, so we have two big organizations that have done a fair amount of research telling us what works with students with ASDs. In the middle, everything here with these green checks are places where both of them overlap. So not only have one organization saying that these are effective practices, we have two. And this red square here tells us these are the behavioral packages. These are interventions that are very commonly used with behavior support plans, positive behavior intervention plan. Okay, so Rob Horner, who's one of our big PBS researchers, tells us that schools are really good at taking a great idea and doing it badly. So we have a mandate, right? You shall do FBA and BSP. We have an effective practice, right? We know it's an effective practice. We know function matters. We know that these are effective strategies for students with autism. We even know these are effective strategies for secondary students with autism, okay? But when we look at the case studies, or the cases, so this is when we have hearing cases, what we see is that hearing officers consistently rule in the favor of parents because school districts forget to implement the positive parts of the positive behavior intervention plans. So they do the PBS plan without the P. I think you know where I'm going there. Okay. So you're a school district, you're losing cases, right? What's your response? Typical school response. I'm going to go get myself either a behavior specialist, or I'm going to train my school psychologists, my special education teachers to increase their skills in these interventions, okay? So what we see in the research, though, is when we do this, and we go back and we look at these behavior support plans that these specialists create on their own, we see that technical adequacy is high. Technical adequacy means that they've selected research-based interventions. They've put these research-based interventions in the right place. These interventions match function, which we talked about earlier, and the importance of that, okay? But what we do see also is contextual fit is low, okay? So we got a really good looking behavior support plan that's going to look dynamite in this kid's folder, but it's not fitting the environment, and therefore it's not likely to happen, okay? So we talked about contextual fit. That's actually one of our learning objectives. I'm just going to read you this definition real quick here. So it's the fit between the behavior support plan and the values, skills, resources, and routines of the people who will carry out the plan. So if this plan is directed at the home environment, this is likely going to be the parents. At the school environment, we're going to be using the teachers, support personnel, administrators, speech language therapists, so all those school personnel, okay? So you can see if we develop a plan and it doesn't fit the values, skills, resources, and routines, it's not likely to be implemented. Okay, so how do we address this? So what happened next is we looked at, well, what if, or I should say Horner and Benazzi looked at here, what if the school team developed a behavior support plan? They know what their values are, they know their routines, they know their skills. Let's have them develop the plan, let's see what we get here. When we do that, contextual fit is high. This makes sense, right? We have the school team developing the plan. They're going to select interventions that they can execute, right? That match their values, that fit their schedules, okay? But we have the wrong interventions being selected. So we have plan being implemented, but the wrong plan. Do we get behavior change? No. So when we're talking about secondary schools here. So just thinking about secondary schools, there's a lot of additional challenges with fitting that environment. I just want to give you 1 second just to think about what high schools look like, what middle schools look like, and we'll pull some of them up. Okay. Now, the first challenge that comes to mind is that these students often have more teachers. So that's going to have to be addressed. They may require us expanding our team. But it also points to the fact that this school team is going to be even more important because we're going to have a lot of adults interacting with this kid. So if we can get a big team together, then we're much better off. And these plans often require coaching, so that this coaching piece is going to become a little bit more difficult if we get too far from that environment. Okay, so we've got a couple problems here. Our solution. When the behavior support plan was developed by a school team that was led by a behavior specialist or somebody that had training in applied behavior analysis, this is what we get. We get a plan that includes the essential components and that fits the environment. Okay. So when we're talking about scaling some of these practices up, we also need to talk a little bit about the environment itself. If my kid's intervention plan is dependent on the values of that school and the skills and resources, I want that school to be functioning as well as possible. One way we do that is through developing schools through positive behavior support, school-wide positive behavior support. And what we look at is schools that have undergone that training piece. It's about 18 hours of initial professional development, and then they follow up in the additional years here and do some more. Our top schools are schools that did not participate in this professional development. And what we see is 16 of the 19 behavior support plans those schools developed were weak, and 0 of the 19 were rated as good or superior. So if you're at one of these schools and a school team's developing your behavior intervention plan, your behavior support plan, and you're a kid, you don't even have a roll of the dice shot at getting a good, technically adequate plan. In our schools, in schools that have undergone school-wide PBS training, what we see is still we have a pretty high number here, 9 that are characterized as weak. But we also see 9 that were rated as good or superior. And this is just the school teams. So we're just kind of stacking the odds in our favor by creating a better, more positive, more accepting environment. So what are the principles of school-wide PBS? I'm going to go over just a couple of the universal ones here. One is that we can teach behaviors effectively. When I first started in education, and probably 7 or 8 years ago, this really seemed foreign to me. This idea that you needed to teach the expected behaviors. 2, we need to intervene early. This is probably not more true than with any population than with our students with ASDs. Use a multi-tiered model of service delivery. Use research-based, scientifically validated interventions. We're going to monitor students' progress towards these interventions. Use data to make decisions. And we're also going to use assessment to identify students, to monitor their progress, and to design interventions. Okay. Here's a triangle. Can't have a presentation without a triangle these days. I just wanted to show you this really quickly. These are just generalizations here. We see, 75 to 85% of students are likely going to respond to your universal systems that every kid gets if you do it right. That depends on the school, and that depends on how well they're implemented. And then you see that at the middle level here, the secondary level, that 10 to 20% of students. Each school is going to have its own triangle, its own pyramid. So that's going to look different based on a number of factors. So these are just some generalizations. The other thing I wanted to point out about this triangle here, the PBS triangle, is at every level, the first intervention listed is effective academic programming. So that's a really important consideration. When we're doing any kind of positive behavior interventions or supports for our students, we have to ask, is that kid appropriately placed into the curriculum? Is that instruction appropriate? Because it's really not ethical in a school setting to be operating on behavior if that kid's sitting in a class where he has no opportunity to learn. I'm just going to hit a couple of the unique difficulties that secondary schools encounter when they try to do this work here. One is the size and institutional nature of secondary schools. I did most of my teaching career was at the elementary level. I taught at a school that had 350 kids. In my district, we have middle schools that have almost 1,000 students and high schools with over 2,000 students. A high school with over 2,000 students has over 100 adults working at it. So these are big ships to steer. So to overcome that, what's important is that we have a leader, a principal that wants to engage in this process, and we have a representative team as well. So representative team doesn't mean that it's a special education teacher, 3 special education teachers and the principal doing this work. What we need are teachers from different grade levels, different subject areas, general education and special education, before we can move that. Limited responsibility. High school teachers are likely to see over 100 students a day. So we have to find a way to neutralize that effect. A lot of schools we're seeing now are doing smaller high schools, or they do a school within a school to kind of reduce the number of touches that these kids see in a day. That really makes all of these interventions a lot easier to execute. 3, staff assumptions about what students should know, right? Do I have any high school teachers here? So it makes sense that if you were a high school teacher, that you would assume that a student having gone through 9 years of school before they got to you would understand the social rules and how to study and how to get along with others. But in reality, is we don't do a very effective job teaching these things at any level. So you're going to get a lot of students at high school that don't have those skills. 4th challenge, frequent class changes. Has anybody ever been on a campus where during the passing period of a giant high school? That's right. It's a scary place. You know, I'm a pretty big guy, and I even won't go out there. I'll just hide in the teacher's room until it's over. So with that, we're going to have to find some ways to structure all of our supports for students, but this also becomes a really good opportunity for intervention. We can actually develop interventions to make these passing periods run smoother. We can teach what's expected. We could teach students that they're supposed to walk on the right side and then wait on the left side during these passing periods. And finally, threat to staff for student misbehavior. When I began teaching, my partner teacher, Tammy Goen, was about 100 pounds. She's a dynamite teacher, but if she's on a high school campus working with some dangerous kids, her physical safety could be in danger. So we do need to think about that, and we need to address that to make sure that everybody's safe. All right, so we talked a little bit about laws and what works with kids, and we even touched a little bit on how we develop schools that are effective. Objective 2, we're talking about how do we engage our school personnel and our families, okay? And what are these processes? So we do this, we engage both parties by teaming. I have a definition of teaming here from Margaret Briggs. A team is a group of individuals who are committed to a shared purpose, to each other, and to working together to achieve a common set of goals, okay? So, these individuals for our behavior support team are likely to be parents, our specialists, our teacher, and any other support staff we may have there. They're working together to achieve a common goal. We're talking about changing behavior. That's generally going to be our common goal. It's also important, though, when we talk about positive behavior interventions, we're not just looking at changing behavior. What we really want to do is improve the quality of life for the student. So that needs to be addressed in our goals. Okay, why are teams important? Well, first, we need a lot of expertise when we're working with our students that have higher needs, especially our students with disabilities. Second, when we develop an intervention, wherever that intervention is done, we're likely to see behavior change. But if we don't bring those interventions into other environments, into the home, into the community environments, we're likely to see that behavior does not generalize past that setting. So we may be able to teach a nice replacement behavior in the school setting, but without including parents, that behavior is likely not going to change at home for them. And same thing, school personnel. As much as we would like parents to be able to fix all of these some of the problem behaviors we see, even if a parent fixes it at home, it's not necessarily going to change at school. So we really need to be working together. So autism and effective teams. I'm actually going to read this definition to you here, or this quote, excuse me. Recent developments in the field of autism and related disabilities have included 2 prominent themes: the emergence of functional assessment as a requisite step in behavioral support, and a growing acknowledgement that families represent the most essential resource for the social, intellectual, emotional, and behavioral development of their children. So we talked earlier, we had a question about including parents, right? This is going to be essential. So we have to use these good behavior practices, and we need to include families. This is the list that Briggs puts out on effective things that effective teams do. So I can get there. And I'm not going to read you this list because we're going to go into a few of them here. First one we see here is missions and goals are clearly stated. When developing a behavior support plan, if you're doing it in a team, what I personally do is I always wait till I have a consensus on what we're doing. So I'm going to set out a couple of things I want everybody to agree to. And what I tell this team is they don't have to agree with me, but we all need to agree on something. And I start by saying everybody's going to agree to do something different because what's working is not working, or what we're doing now is not working. And two is I want everybody to do something. Okay, we're not going to put this all on the parent. We're not going to put this all on the classroom teacher. We're all going to work together to support this student. Most teams agree to that. It's hard to disagree with that, right? I'm going to skip to the third one there. Expertise among members. We talked about behavioral expertise. Okay? Oftentimes we need some form of curricular expertise. Are we teaching appropriately? Okay? And lastly, we need expertise on the child. So when we think about expertise of a child, who was that expert? Who was that child expert? The child. The child or the parent, right? If we have a verbal kid, we better be asking them what they want. And we should always be including the parent and getting their perspective on these things. Okay. Commitment to process and product. Again, we talked earlier about our product is going to be behavior change, right? And not just behavior change, but we're trying to improve this young person's life. And also we want to commit to a process. This is our process we're going to go to. We're all going to agree to do something different. We're all going to agree that what we're doing now isn't working. Okay? And trust is built and maintained. I'm going to skip down there. So what we see is Larson identified a couple areas here. Honesty. Are we doing what we said we'd do? Openness. So have we created an environment where people can share freely? Consistency. Are we implementing these interventions on time and appropriately, and mutual respect, so that we can have teams that share openly? Leadership is strong. Our school leaders are our principals. It's important that we include them when we develop these behavior support plans. Oftentimes, what you'll see is a principal has knowledge of a resource that's at that school that nobody else will know about. They know about the budgets. They know about the extra rec aid that has a half an hour that's not scheduled right now that it could come in and do some tutoring or provide some social reinforcement. So include those principles. And lastly here, I'm just going to end on system thinking prevails. When doing research for this, I came across a PowerPoint that George Sagai put together, and it had an anonymous quote. And it said, "Public policy is the allocation of limited resources for unlimited need." So we know that we have to be executing these behavior plans, but we also need to do this in a way that's systematic and in a way that's efficient, because we will literally run out of resources if we're not careful. To do that, we need to build effective school environments, and we need to build effective teams that can do this work fairly quickly and without the need for extensive coaching, so that we can get on to the next one. So the more effort we spend in developing these systems, the more efficient we'll be.
So how do we get to talking about competing behavior pathway? And what I'm not going to tell you is that Luke Anderson and I were sitting in an airport in Denver, Colorado, coming back from a positive behavior support conference, which you've probably figured out that he likes PBS. You'll find that I really like PBS too. But we were talking, and he had mentioned that we had an opportunity to present here, and I said, let's include Erin Chargan. And I knew that if we called her, she'd be grocery shopping with both of her kids in her arms, and she'd have her phone off to the side, and she would do anything to just get off the phone. And so she said yes. And but that's not what I'm going to tell you about. What actually I'm going to tell you about is that we come to competing behavior pathway through kind of a history of researchers. And actually I was talking to Dr. Sprague at the University of Oregon last week, and I said, where did competing behavior pathway actually originate? I had some ideas. I know where my training had come from. I know what books I had to read. And so one of the things that he had mentioned and actually sent me a citation for is that there was a gentleman by the name of Felix Billingsley who in 1985 published an article called Competing Behavior. And one of the things that we can think of with when we talk about competing behavior, right, is that those are two behaviors that we as human beings cannot do simultaneously. So for example, I can't run and walk at the same time. Later on, Billingsley and Rob Horner from the University of Oregon published a number of papers, which I'm not going to tell you what those papers were. However, that led to Dr. Horner and Dr. O'Neill publishing a book in 1990 and then again in 1997 about practical systems for doing functional behavior assessment. From there, you see that Horner and Crone come together, and they too publish a book in 2003. How do I fit into this? Well, some of you don't know this, but Erin Chargan happens to be my wife. And because of her and Ron Huff, I am where I am today. And I actually say that humorously in the sense that if I had not met Dr. Huff, I probably would not be in the field that I'm in. And of course, had I not met Erin Chargan, I clearly would not have accomplished a number of things that I have. But the reason why I loop Erin into this is that we both went to the University of Oregon together for grad school, and one of the courses that you were required to take was advanced behavior supports, that was taught by Dr. Horner and Dr. Sagai. And one of the things that we were or one of the tools that we were introduced to was competing behavior pathway. And we came back to Sacramento, our home, and just to give you a little history and context of where that went is that I went to work for San Juan Unified School District, a school district made up of about 54,000 students. Some numbers to think about is that about 8 to 11% of them are identified as special needs. Approximately maybe 20 to 22% can be identified with emotional or behavioral challenges. And then, as Luke mentioned, that secondary level of education tends to make up the greatest amount of business around problem behavior through suspension and expulsions. And what we found in San Juan was that about 64% of all suspensions and expulsions came from middle school and high school. So when you're the only two behaviorists in the district, and I haven't told you about the other one, Jim Wood, you can imagine we had a lot of work, especially with our title, and we were trying to figure out how we were going to do competing behavior path in a school with 54,000 students with all of those potential clients. One of the things we came up with is that every Tuesday afternoon, Jim Wood and I would go into two separate rooms, and every hour we'd have a team from anywhere in the district which represented the teachers, the principal, maybe the psychologist, and the parents. And that was the only way we agreed to meet with them, is that they would come into the room and we would give them an hour of time doing competing behavior pathway to kind of look at how we could create some quick behavior supports, determine if we needed to do data collection, maybe we could get some interventions in place right away. I can tell you that year we were packed. We couldn't have had enough Tuesdays in the week to have done the work that was coming to us. So Luke, Jim, and I decided we were going to go train schools. And as he mentioned, after 18 hours of professional development, a team is kind of seen as actually a school site team is actually seen as being a little bit more skilled at dealing with behavior. Well, we actually figured that at about 6 to 9 months of training, we'd actually show them tools that we were using as behaviorists or psychologists or educators when doing functional behavior assessment. And I can tell you at Trajan Elementary on Greenback and Hazel at 7 o'clock in the morning every Friday, I had an educational team that would come together and we would use this tool. And teachers were excited. Teachers were actually leading the process, and school principals were hearing about it and they wanted to learn more about it. And as elementary schools were using these tools and bragging about the success they were having, middle school and high school administrators wanted us to come train them. So that's kind of the story in a nutshell, which gives you a general idea of how we come to competing behavior pathway in this presentation. Now what my job is to demonstrate for you what that looks like. We've kind of told you that it's connected to functional behavior assessment, it's connected to PBS and research and such. It's a system for problem solving. And one of the things that you want to, I've just kind of cited a few points here, is that it allows us to understand factors that contribute to the occurrence of behavior. So all of the behaviorists in the room, how many behavior specialists, behavior analysts, highly trained behavior people, right? So most of us know that when we're doing behavior support assessment, or if we're listening to folks that are giving us information, we're really listening for those environmental contributors to behavior. The other thing is we want to, I mean, any of us that are doing behavior support planning and have to produce a report or add it to an IEP or submit it to some group, we definitely want to make sure we're meeting the responsibilities of IDEA or Hughes bill, right? There's no reason to go through this exercise if it doesn't serve us in some way too, and that we can meet our responsibilities under our job description, make sure that we're doing it well, and that it's indicative of quality work. It directs us on how we might respond in intervention. So as we're collecting this information, right, we really already should be in a mindset of we're hearing some ideas from the people we're working with. They're kind of telling us what those resources are. They're telling us the interventions. They're telling us the time available. They're telling us which educators or other support staff really like the kid and who to really stay away from. So we're getting some ideas in this process. It leads to good contextual fit, and Luke already mentioned what the definition of contextual fit is. But just as I mentioned, we're learning a lot about the environment that the student spends a lot of time in, and we're kind of figuring out in our mind where all of that's going to fit in. We use competing behavior pathway in a team-based approach, and I think that's what we like the most about it. It's a tool that you can do by yourself at your desk. As I was a kindergarten teacher. I've worked in preschools, and I will tell you right now, had I had competing path when I was in a preschool role, especially with children with behavior issues and IEPs, I most likely would have used this tool, put it on a clipboard. I would have actually sat down 2 weeks into my school year and started filling it out about those kids who were going to require a little more help and intervention. I would have put it on a clipboard and turned it backwards on my wall with their name on it, and it would have been my quick way of referencing what interventions I needed to do. It would have made a quick way for me to kind of reference. So one, you can use the tool alone. However, it is always better to use the tool with friends. Allows a group of people to understand the values, limits, and tolerance levels of individuals. When you're working with folks who have a concern about a student with behavior challenges, there are going to be some folks that are worn out. They've tried everything that's in their coping skills. So understandably, they're going to have doubt, they're going to have frustration, and you're hearing some of those things. And I don't usually call anybody out during this teaming process. I'm really listening for that. That's my job, is to figure out those who are tired. Those are going to be the people who I probably don't call on right away to do some intervention ideas. I'm going to also encourage team members to participate. This is the opportunity where I'm going to talk less and I'm going to become a better listener. And I can tell you right now, after 11 years and about a couple of months of marriage, it's taken me that long, but I've learned that you have to be a good listener. And I think that competing behavior pathway really helped me in learning that skill a little faster. It might have been 22 years had I not used competing behavior pathway. Wow. Also, that, it lets us communicate. So as you're completing the competing behavior pathway form and you're getting that information, you're also communicating with others. And one of the keys of communication is, one, you're getting agreement. You're finding out what we all agree about. And the other is that it lets us have greater understanding, and with understanding, hopefully we get some consistency. And that's kind of the key when working with individuals with behavior challenges. And probably, as you notice on the bottom, and for people involved, we can make them feel valued, because I think a lot of times when we're working with teams in home programs, middle schools, high schools, even adult ed centers, oftentimes you find that people have been deprived of feeling valued. And so one of the books that I brought, just so that if you need to read up on how to value others who are on a pretty deprived schedule of feeling valued, there's a great book called Positivity. And this is a mandatory read for all behavior specialists and behavior analysts, and probably anybody who's working with children, and maybe even for yourself, but it's based on phenomenal research, but really points out that we need to reinforce those who are giving us information about the competing behavior model. So some of you are probably saying, well, how does competing behaviors pathway support some of our responsibilities as behavior specialists, behavior analysts, psychologists, others who do behavior support planning? Obviously, I'm not going to go over these terms. I mean, they're commonly used terms when we're doing behavior support planning. But I think the key is that, you know, obviously we need to identify and define the problem behavior. We have to figure out what events, times, situations that predict when the problem behavior will occur. We want to develop one or more summary statements. If I'm working in a middle school or a high school and I'm working with 5 or 6 teachers and I'm using the competing behavior pathway, I can quickly figure out that I'm going to probably be getting a lot of different hypothesis statements or hypotheses statements. So I think one of the things that you'll find with competing behavior pathways is that you're going to actually get a lot of different perspectives of why that behavior is occurring or under what conditions or why that behavior is working for the young person. Also, it's going to direct us in our observations. If we're getting information, we kind of can then ask questions about, well, when's that behavior more likely to occur? Then I can plan that into my schedule so that I can make sure I can show up and actually observe it. So the nice thing about competing behavior pathway is that it also lets us operate more efficiently when we have a lot of responsibility and are trying to figure out when will I go in and observe this student. Okay, so we're going to construct a competing behavior model so that we can go through the exercise. I'll tell you right now that this is a 10-week graduate course at the University of Oregon, so we're going to do this in about 15 minutes. But since I'm on video and Dr. Horner or Dr. Sagai might see this video, I want you to know that you really should go through 10 weeks of training. And I've also brought the functional assessment book, and I don't receive any royalties for these books. These are books that I just beat up in my work every year. However, if you'd like to see it, you're more than welcome to after the presentation. But I wanted you to know that there are some materials there to support you in using competing behavior pathway 2. So we want to get the school staff, parents, caregiver, maybe the yard duty and maybe even the student together in a meeting. I work in foster homes. Sometimes we're bringing that staff together. Maybe the owner, and maybe the director. It could be the daily staff. In some cases, it's a student. So again, competing behavior pathway can be used in a lot of different areas, but especially with our secondary folks. Here's what the competing behavior pathways looks like, and I'm going to go over these boxes in a moment. It can look a little intimidating at first, but it is actually pretty straightforward useful tool. Our favorite thing to do both in San Juan Unified and I'm now in Folsom Cordova Unified School District is that we go to a site and we make sure this is up on a dry erase board, construction paper. Sometimes we go to a printer and print out about 8 or 9, 10 sheets and we tape them all up, and you'll actually see that in our short video that we actually did that, where we can handwrite these key areas that we're trying to gain information on, and we'll just stick them up on a wall, and that's kind of the beginning point before the team begins to kind of share information. There's also, I just want to point out that you have the competing behavior pathways up on the top portion. You might think of that as the assessment portion. And then you have the 4 boxes along the bottom, starting with the setting, event, manipulations across. You might want to think of that as the intervention portion. Okay, so here's our competing behavior pathways again, and I'm going to kind of go through this in the order that I would as a behavior analyst working with a team. I'm going to always start out with my problem behavior area because that's what everybody wants to tell you about, right? And I'm listening for what that is, and I'm going to try to get something in. Now, my box might be bigger, but I definitely am not going to make my box too big because I'm really trying to get a behavior that is really clear to me, that I'm going to get a pretty good description of, because at some point I'd like to go out and observe that behavior. I'm also going to listen to what the antecedents are. Some of you might hear the term triggers or predictors of the behavior. So I'm going to go from problem behavior to antecedents, and then I'm going to be listening for the consequence, the maintaining consequence. And I'm not thinking function yet. I'm actually thinking about those things that occur immediately after the behavior. So for example, I have a 3-year-old son and a 6-year-old daughter, and my 3-year-old son throws an object at his sister, right? And maybe I didn't see that antecedent. All I see is the toy that's being thrown at her. And the maintaining consequence might be that I ran into the room and I said, "Don't you do that anymore." Right? We haven't determined function yet, but clearly we can put in the maintaining consequence that Dad walked into the room, gestured with his finger, "Don't you do that anymore." And that's what I'm going to write in there. We'll figure out the function of that behavior later on as we're getting more information. But I will tell you for Charlie, it's usually that he has figured out that if he does that a few more times, I'll stay in the room, and now he has a playmate. So for those of you that are behaviorally trained, the function of that behavior is? Thank you. So you're getting the point. What you don't see is that there might be a box over here over Luke's head that actually might have the 2 functions for the radical behavior analyst. And for those of us who are looser fit behaviorists, we have 3 functions, right? Gain, avoid, and stimulatory, right? But of course, there's always a debate about that. But for right now, we'll say that maybe all 3 are right there, because as we're trying to figure out why Charlie threw the toy and what consequence occurred, what I might be doing if I were doing my competing path on myself, and that we figured out that Charlie's doing this for attention, is we'd put a circle around attention. If I'm working with a really challenging team that can't go there with me and wants to debate the functions of behavior, and that happens, what I'll do is create a bunch of hypotheticals, and as they dismiss them, I cross them out, and then I go, "What do we have left?" And they go, "Oh, we never saw it that way." Interestingly enough, that does oftentimes eliminate needing to debate if behavior is functional or something else. And then what I do is I'm listening for setting events, and I'll give you the definition for setting events later, but some of you that are really accustomed to the behavioral language out there, you might think of that as an EO, an establishing operation of some sort. And we do listen for that often, because there often is something that's tied to the EO. And then we're going to look at the high road, and that isn't the technical language, but that's actually the desired alternative behavior up here, right? And what's going on up here is oftentimes I'm trying to figure out what maybe the rest of the kids are doing right. I'm trying to figure out, that's kind of my norm reference area. I might be talking to a bunch of maybe 5 middle school teachers, and I say, "Well, what are the other kids doing when that antecedent occurs?" And they'll say they're on task, they have their pencil in their hand, their face is down towards their desk, they're completing their work. And then I'll say, "And what's the maintaining consequence for that?" And oftentimes we get, "Huh?" And I'll go, "What happens immediately after that behavior?" And I get a second, "Huh?" And so sometimes in those cases, I'll say, "What really happens there?" And we kind of have to work that through, and maybe I'll get, "Will they get more work?" Maybe they get a thumbs up. "I like that you're doing your work." Some teachers I know still, even in middle school and high school, might give a Jolly Rancher, something of that sort. So I'm trying to figure out what those kids are getting. So I've got this pattern going, I've got this pattern, and then we'll get into the acceptable alternative behavior, because what O'Neill teaches us is that the acceptable alternative behavior must serve the same function. And as Erin had mentioned to me in our preparation of this presentation, she said, "But the number one thing that you're going to find working with teams is they're going to say, 'Well, why shouldn't the kid just have this happen and do that? And if we do this, aren't we letting them get away with something?'" And the reality is that we know function-wise that we really do need to identify a behavior that will serve the same function if we're ever going to get up to this portion. And the reason for that is that oftentimes this needs to be taught, and we probably need to think of some reinforcement strategies also to bring that behavior along. Along the bottom portion in the behavior intervention section, you're going to have setting event manipulations. Notice this box corresponds with setting events problems. Antecedent manipulations corresponds with antecedent issues or concerns, or at least the antecedents that bring about the problem behavior. We're going to look at behavior teaching. The reason why this box reads behavior teaching is because we're going to identify strategies for a couple of different things. One is we're going to develop specific interventions for bringing about our acceptable alternative and making sure that it serves the purpose for the young person to receive the reinforcer that's already occurring for the problem behavior. But we're also going to start outlining some specific interventions for the desired alternative as well. And then Luke also mentioned in our preparation for the training, he wanted to make sure that I did not miss this point, and it's a very valid one, is that when we start talking about the consequence manipulations, one is that we want to talk about those reinforcers that we want to limit for the problem behavior, and we also want to cite those reinforcers that we want to enhance for both the desired behavior and the acceptable alternative behavior. So you can start to get an idea that this competing behavior model that we've been taught begins to kind of address that issue of I can't walk and run at the same time. And if the goal is that, if the issue is that walking is bad and the desired behavior is running, then one of the things that we're going to have to do is figure out what's the acceptable alternative and what might be the acceptable alternative for running or walking and running. A jog, a trot, what is there, speed walk now, right? So that might be the acceptable alternative, and then up there is the desired alternative. But the real key is that we also want to be mindful of that maybe if Jeff will, when Jeff walks, we're going to use planned ignoring, assuming that it's a tension function or even a tangible. When he trots or walks quickly, his wife will give him $5. And if he runs, he gets $50, right? So we're going to think really about how we might, manipulate and use reinforcement to bring about the ultimate behavior. All right. Testable hypothesis statement, this is the nucleus of all of our competing path efforts. What you'll notice is that your competing path right here, this is our hypothesis statement in the shaded gray. Here's our competing path again, right here. And I just want to go over this really quickly. When I'm doing competing path, I start with what's the problem behavior? Tell me more about the problem behavior. What's the antecedents? I'm going to say what happened right before that behavior? What are the consequences? What happened after that behavior? And then oftentimes I don't have to ask about setting events. I'm kind of listening for those. And that's partly because they're kind of complex for us to understand, and we want to be very careful. But we do have kind of a place for them, and I'll share more in a moment. Setting events include earlier situations or continuing situations that may set the stage for problem behavior to occur. So I will tell you earlier, Luke mentioned that inconsistent use of medication, not having a set schedule, not properly receiving it. That would be a setting event issue. Working in middle schools and high schools, I also worked at Orangeville Adult Ed Center across from, help me, the community college, American River. And one of the things that we found working with secondary folks and adult ed centers is that relationships form. So if I'm working with a young man with autism who's had a girlfriend for a week, and he comes to class, and on his way to class, his girlfriend says, psh, psh, come here, I'm not going to date you anymore. And then that young man, he's sad, he's hurting, he walks into the class, and his teacher says, you're late, sit down. And he goes, I'm out of here, right? We know that the antecedent for the I'm out of here, right, was the teacher saying, you're late, sit down. That was the immediate antecedent. However, probably the breakup a few minutes earlier probably made that antecedent a little stronger. So one of the things that is important is we're listening to setting events, but if you think the reinforcement question when working with educators is complex, try to have one about setting events. But it's just kind of you just kind of want to learn how to use them. I think for the most part, I've given you a really good understanding of competing behavior model. However, I just want to show you, and I'm not going to go through each of these because you should already know, start at behavior, go to antecedent, right? go to consequence, then listen for setting events, go to the high road, the desired alternative behavior, then look at the acceptable alternative. Here's a scenario that we use Jeff, which isn't me, but we put that name in. When Jeff is seated near peers, he begins, what does that say? We did something. He begins talking to get attention from his peers. These behaviors are more likely to occur when he hasn't had peer contact for 30 minutes. So what you get is the problem behavior, talking, off-task behavior in the class. It's when he's around preferred peers. It's to get their attention. And we've identified a setting event as lack or deprivation of peer contact for 30 minutes. And I already gave you kind of a sample of when something actually happens. In this particular case, we might have a deprivation going, but in the case where the girl breaks up with the boy, that's definitely not a deprivation. He was hoping he'd be deprived of that breakup, but that's not how it worked out. He was actually given something, bad news. We go to the high road, desired alternative, typical consequence, the acceptable alternative. And then we have our assessment portion. O'Neill teaches us that we should not propose to reduce a problem behavior without identifying alternative replacement behaviors. Through the competing behavior model, we've identified two, the desired behavior and the acceptable alternative. So we're meeting the law and we're also meeting best practice. We've kind of gone over those general areas. We used me as an example as having a problem behavior being disruptive in class, which I was most of my public education experience. But really what you see here is that the team did a great job of completing the competing behavior path to help me. And what has happened is in the end, in the beginning, we had a blank form, and now we have a completed form. A number of things can happen here. If the team gives a thumbs up and we have agreement, we believe that's data. And we can start to move forward towards intervention. If the team kind of is inconsistent, then somebody like Aaron, Luke, myself, or some of you go out and do observation to confirm that hypothesis statement and decide, you know what, we really don't even have a really good idea about this problem behavior. Let's get the team together. Or, you know what, the team was pretty close and we can move forward with the interventions. In a lot of cases, a lot of staff, parents, site administrators get some real aha moments in this short time that we're working together, and they will go out and start working with that kid tomorrow and making a change in everybody's life, especially the young person. And a lot of times when that kind of success happens, you see parents, the educator, and the student actually having a much better relationship. So I just wanted to finish with showing you the completed competing path version. And Aaron?
So I have a couple examples. We'll get through them as quickly as we do. Feel free to ask me questions. This will give you some intervention ideas, which I think is important as practitioners as you leave here today. So my first kiddo that I want to talk to you about, well, he's not a kiddo anymore. He's a young man. He's a 12th grade male. His name, we're going to call him CM for our sake here. He was diagnosed with autism. He attends an ILS class / SDC class. Part of his day is in ILS, part of his day is in SDC with some mainstream. ILS is independent living skills, SDC is special day class. His teacher-student ratio is relatively high. In the ILS class, we have 3 teachers to 12 students, and in the SDC class, he had 3 teachers to 9 students. And his parent involvement was high. We've talked a lot about parents today. I thoroughly enjoy working with families, and in this situation, CM's parents were very involved in his behavior interventions. CM had 2 behaviors that we're going to discuss today. The first one was verbal protest, so he would defined as making a negative verbal statement such as, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do work, I hate school, something to that effect. The second behavior was not completing his work when presented with a task. So his teacher or the aide in the class would give him a task to do, and he would get up from his seat, walk around the room, go do something else. He was off task. So those were the 2 behaviors of concern. I put both of them on the problem behavior here is because they are serving the same function. When the problem behavior serves a different function, you would always do a different competing path. It's very important not to put different functions on the same competing behavior path. But for our sake here, I did group them together. So we have verbal protest and work not done. The antecedents are triggers for CM. And let me back up a step. We were at an IEP meeting, and the mom was really frustrated because her son was having these behaviors, and she's been hearing over and over again how he's having these behaviors. And the teacher, I could tell, was kind of exhausted as well. So everyone, though, was starting to come up with some ideas. And I thought, hey, let's do a systematic approach to this and get this on the competing path. And so we were able to do this right there. Typically, that's not, an IEP is not a place to do that. It happened to work in this setting, and then we were able to follow up with these interventions. So the demand, an antecedent to his problem behavior was a demand, typically a non-preferred task, which for CM is reading, math, or writing. The typical consequence is the teacher would say, CM, you need to do this. CM, you need to do this. Or maybe a peer would even prompt him. They might give him 10 instructions during that time period. Sometimes he would comply. Many times he did not comply. And as you can probably visualize, him walking around the classroom was a pretty big distraction to the other students. And that was hard for the teacher and for the aides. A setting event for him would be that there were two. One is when he was engaged in a highly preferred activity. CM really likes trains. He always has. I've known the student since he was 2. And he really enjoys SpongeBob. And so if he was engaged in something about that, either a book, a computer program, something, it was very hard to take him away from those activities. And Monday was a setting event. The schedule was always different on Monday at this high school, and he had a difficult time transitioning on days that were different from the majority of his week. The team hypothesized, that he had an avoidance, escape, maintain function for his behavior. Now, obviously, when we asked, hey, what do you want CM to do? And this is exactly how we would propose this in a meeting. The parent and the teacher said, we want him to do what he's asked. It's pretty simple. That's what we want. I want to be able to give it an instruction, give him a math page, give him a reading assignment, and he gets to work. However, I can't go from here to here. I wish I could. I wouldn't be up here today if we could. You wouldn't need us behaviorists around. But it's very challenging to go from here to here. So what we did is we proposed some acceptable alternative behaviors. And this box, I think, is the most important box to the teacher. Because if I pick, or if the team picks acceptable alternatives that are not acceptable to the teacher, I don't have buy-in. And if I don't have buy-in from the classroom teacher, I will not get to this goal. So I really like the teacher to guide this box. What is acceptable to her in a classroom may not be acceptable to me. I may have more tolerance over some things, and she may say, no, this is absolutely my rule. We must follow this rule. So this is where I think it's worth spending some time on. So the team decided to teach Sam to request more time with his preferred activity. So yes, we were still going to give him a demand, but if he was with his preferred activity, he could then either verbally or with an icon say, I need 3 more minutes. Now we would put boundaries around it so he wasn't asking for 3 more minutes all day long. And those interventions we can get into at another session. But we would give him time to have ownership of, hey, I need more time at this, rather than him protesting or yelling out in class. And then once he was in a task in the work that we wanted him to do, we taught him, we were going to teach him to ask for a break. Rather than just leaving the work area and walking around the classroom, he could easily say, I need a break. He goes, does his thing, and then we get him back. Yes, that's not the ideal. We want him working. We want him doing all of his classwork, but it's our starting point. And he's being successful. He's being heavily reinforced for this, which is the consequence over here. And we are moving our way up to our high road, up to that desired behavior. So this is what Jeff was talking about, the bottom half of the competing path form that's in your handout. We tend to make this a one sheet when we're going over several interventions for a child. So this is your interventions. This is what are we going to do to get our student to where we need him to be. I will just go over a couple of these. So for instance, we start with behavior first. Well, we are going to teach him to request more time. And how are we going to do that? We're going to outline that here. We are also going to teach CM that when he is in a non-preferred activity, he can request a break. He can say, I need 5 more minutes, or I need to take a walk break outside, and then I can come back and do work. Those are some of the behavior teaching strategies we're going to do. When we look at antecedent manipulations, we are going to pre-warn CM about transitions from preferred to non-preferred. And I know that sounds simple, Sometimes we need to do it verbally, sometimes visually, sometimes with many reminders. We need to pre-warn them that you are going to be able to engage in this highly preferred item for this long, and then you need to transition to this moderately or low preferred item. Another antecedent manipulation is that we break down the tasks into smaller segments. Yes, we need him to complete his math page. We need him to complete his reading assignment. But he's not to the point, his baseline data is showing us that it's going to take a little bit, it's going to take us to break it down before he completes it. So he may do 10 problems, or 3 problems for that matter, and then we'll reinforce him. Again, when we talked about setting event manipulations for CM, that Monday was tough for him. So we could do a couple things. As soon as he gets to school, we can neutralize the setting event by one of the adults in the classroom laying out the schedule for him. So he knows right away, this is what you're going to be doing today. Because we had such parents that were highly involved, mom or dad could also do that Sunday night or the Monday before school. So we could really hit that a couple times for him. So let's have him go to school with less anxiety about Monday being a change day, and really teaching him what will be expected of him that day. And then another setting event manipulation is that we want him to pick his reinforcer. This kiddo has always been a reinforcer kid. He wants certain things and he wants them now. So when he comes to school and he needs to do his task, prior to that task, we're going to let him choose what he's working for. Okay, I'm going to work for this trained book, I'm going to work for this trained computer program, and then he'll more likely get to work to go earn that activity. So that was CM, and again, he was pretty much in a special education classroom setting. I want to give you another quick example. I won't go over both of the competing paths here, but what I want to highlight here is this child is in a regular education classroom setting. So the supports look different in regular ed, right? We have one teacher, we have 32 kids. Now this classroom does have an aide that is currently being faded though. So the competing behavior path can work in different environments. It doesn't just have to work in an SDC more contained class with higher levels of support. What's great about this example is that when we were brought onto this case, he was a step away from being removed from this regular ed environment. And now, as I'm showing you these examples today, we're working on fading the one-to-one aid, and he's successful in that or in his regular ed environment. So that's, again, that proof of these things really work. MA had a lot of behaviors when we first started with him. So when we got to the team, they just had a list. This is what he's doing, and we need to make it stop. So one of the takeaways from today's session that I want you to have is when you're looking at several behaviors, you really need to pick 1 or 2 to start with. And what I like to look at is, do they fall under the 5 Ds? The 5 Ds would be, is the behavior dangerous? Is it destructive? Is it disruptive? Is it disgusting? Or is it developmentally inappropriate? Right? Like if you have a kid who's picking his nose all day and he's in 7th grade, that's disgusting, and it's social suicide also, so we need to stop that for him. So when we're looking at MA, 2 of his behaviors really fell under dangerous and destructive. So we need to address those first. Okay, so yes, you're gonna run across kids, maybe some kids of your own that have several behaviors, but let's figure out where they fall into this. We targeted the inappropriate social contact and the aggression, of course. Of course we would target aggression. Inappropriate social contact had an aggression component because he would flick kids on the head. That was his way of initiating social opportunities with him. He didn't want to hurt them. He didn't know how to initiate with them. So we taught things like 5 and up, high five and what's up. Give him some interventions, and then we had to teach his peers to accept those interventions, so they would say, oh, I'm good, or how are you, or give him a high five back. So what I want to show you here is that while our task was really high, we needed to address the other 2 first. I have 2 final thoughts before you guys get out of here. Thank you for your patience. One is that competing path does not just only work in the school setting, it works in the home setting. While we have 2 school district people here with us, I do half of my work in schools and half of my work in home settings. And when I'm working with a family and we're trying to find out the function of problem behavior, it's often good to pull out this tool because you may have parents, grandparents, caregivers, older siblings who are on different pages. And then our final thoughts for you today is that we really want to include all the implementers that are important adults in the young person's life. Who is important in that child's life? Those people need to be a part of this planning process. And when we do that, we ensure that contextual fit that we know the research tells us over and over again. That's the difference between your great plan going in the file cabinet and never being looked at, or your great plan being a living document that we're using on a daily basis. We know that the research supports that when our stakeholders, so all the people involved in the plan, feel that their values have been heard, this takes off. So we want to hear everyone, and I think Jeff did a nice job of explaining that. The competing behavior pathway is the systematic change. I'm a very linear thinker, so this works really well for me because I can go out into an environment where people have a lot of emotions and say, okay, let's break it down and find our solution. And this systematic process allows us to do that. And then finally, we are in a world as educators and practitioners and families where we're in times where we're asked to do more with less. And because of that, we have to be efficient with our time. That's just a fact, with our time and our other resources. I think this gives you that. This gives you the tool to get out there, like in a Tuesday hour meeting, and say, I can now have a tool and have some interventions that will change the behavior of a child. And that's why we're here today. And I know secondary can be a daunting place, secondary school, but the important thing to take away is that it is doable to change behavior, not only with our little guys, but also in the secondary schools as well. Thank you very much.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was created in 1998 with a promise to find cures for neurodevelopmental disorders. Every day, our physicians and researchers come closer to fulfilling that promise. Their groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other brain disorders are helping children achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.